Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. It's 2 p.m. or just after UK time, and I'm David Mills. I'm welcoming you to the 252nd CGHE webinar. We are well above our quarter millennia here, and it's a great honor to be inviting Raqib Chowdhury and Arif Kabir to speak today's webinar. I'm very aware that we're particularly lucky that Raqib has stayed up to 1 o'clock in the morning Australia time to join us, and Arif, it's 8 p.m. for you in Dhaka. So thank you for coming along, and we're looking forward to a really interesting talk today. The title is Coloniality as a Frame of Understanding, Interventional Politics in the Privatization of Bangladeshi Higher Education. And as I said, Raqib is at Monash and Arif's at the University of Dhaka in Bangladesh, and they've published a book recently called The Privatization of Higher Education in Post-Colonial Bangladesh, The Politics of Intervention and Control. And I think this is a really great title, which describes very well the sort of the workings through of neoliberalism in privatization in what is the fastest growing sort of economy in South Asia, and how this is implicated in reshaping higher education, both through massification, policy reforms, and tensions between control and autonomy. So we will share the preface as reading for this book. Please feel free to read it and see what you think of it. Before I ask Raqib and Arif to speak, there's a few housekeeping announcements as ever. Just to remind you, we have organized this such that it's being recorded. So if you do come forward and chat after the presentation, you will be recorded as well, and then it will be made available on YouTube tomorrow for those of you who so all our webinars are available on YouTube. So do go back to them if you need to. And transcripts, the chat function will also be posted. The usual rules apply. Please keep yourself muted unless you've been asked to speak a question. Use the speaker view so you can see more clearly. And then please do post a chat or a comment in the chat function at any point. And then when it comes to question time, I'll invite you to come forward, and you can put your video on and ask a question. And then we can have a really sort of open conversation about the issues. So with no more ado, I'll pass over to Raqib and Arif. The webinar is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. It's a great pleasure for me and my colleague, Professor Arif Kabir, to be here presenting for the Center of Global Higher Education seminar. So thank you, David. Thank you, Trevor, of course, for taking care of everything behind the scenes. And a special thanks to Professor Simon Marginson for inviting us to deliver this presentation based on this book that Arif and I published earlier this year. It's a great pleasure. Just a reminder that it's 1 in the morning on a Wednesday in Melbourne, where I am right now, feeling a bit sleepy, but really, really excited just to be here to share recent research from Bangladesh, where we both are originally from, to a global audience. Really great to see you all here virtually. I'll refer to this part of the title of the book and the presentation, which is titled Coloniality as a Frame of Understanding, is one aspect of the book that the presentation is based about. So while we will talk about the book, the different chapters and the arguments that we've made and the findings, the focus in a sense would be on this part of the title, post-colonial. It is a problematic title, and we felt the need to write a preface for the book to explain our positions. And the preface, just as a reminder, is available for you to read along with the foreword by Professor Bob Lingard from University of Queensland, Australia. It's available on the website. So let's get started. The book itself came out earlier this year, as I said, and it explores the political dimension of the nature of higher education in Bangladesh in the private sector, the political element of it, in particular looking at neoliberalism as a construct, as a political construct, as a product of the West, and as as offered as a ready-made policy solution to the problems that we've seen in the country since independence and even before that. We also look at the chronology of the policy reforms and the massification that David talked about. And a kind of sustained friction that we've seen over the last 4 decades between control, autonomy, and all the friction in between the government and other vested interest groups. In writing the book, we realized there was a need for a preface. And in that preface, which is available for reading, we tried to acknowledge our geopolitical and onto-epistemological positionalities. That's Arif and I, as born in Bangladesh, but scholars who are kind of trained in the West, both teaching and working across several countries, including Australia. And our positions as diasporic and hybridized scholars. In doing so, we realized that predominantly the discourses that we refer to theorize our understandings are Eurocentric, Western. So we felt the need for global South, post-colonial and decolonial research literature, which is at the heart of our theoretical understanding in the book. So in writing the preface, we tried to locate ourselves. And at the beginning, we sort of felt like, how do we actually positioning ourselves? We are both citizens from 2 countries, but within that, we also have our own ethnic identity. So where do we actually start for? Is it preposterous for us to research on Bangladeshi higher education, having been outside the country for such a long time? I myself have spent more than half of my life outside Bangladesh. So is that kind of patronizing in any way? Or do we see ourselves simply as a global citizen? Then again, of course, we realize Arif and I are both socioeconomically, culturally privileged. We've been trained in the West. We are male, we are Bangladeshi Australians of a certain age, and working in 2020, 2021. All of these intersections would make us think in certain ways. And if I use Foucault's term, the episteme that defines us, makes us speak in a certain way. So the preface was our way of problematizing our location within the epistemic frameworks of the book and the analysis that we used in the book. Growing up in the 90s, when I did my undergraduate studies in Bangladesh, Dhaka University, theories were much simpler. Critical theories were not as developed as they are now, 40 years on. So in my master's year at Dhaka University, we had to choose between the option of third world literature or continental literature, problematic terms that we wouldn't use anymore. So third world, no, it's not really third world. What is a third world? Who defines third world? And continental literature was actually a synonym for European, non-English European literature. So in other words, the continent is Europe. It's not any other continent. Over the next few decades, Bangladesh became the more politically correct and euphemistically termed least developed country, and then underdeveloped country, and finally a developing country. Where do these labels come from? Then again, Bangladesh is a Southeast Asian country, an Asian country. It's part of this so-called Indian subcontinent, and often referred to as an overpopulated country. And again, these terms are problematic. So we have the political euphemism, but where are these labels coming from? If it's overpopulated, in what sense is it overpopulated? What is the benchmark? When you cross it, you become overpopulated. Is there a particular, where are these metrics coming from? So these were some of the questions that we tried to situate before getting into the book. So the notion of the third world, a term that we don't use anymore because it's kind of pejorative, is interesting. With the fall of the Soviet Union, by the 90s, mid-90s, the world realized the so-called decolonization project of former colonies such as Bangladesh failed. And the notion of post-colonial colonialism no longer had sufficient explanatory power to account for what was happening in former colonies such as Bangladesh, or even in countries that arguably never had colonial rule like the one we had in India. New power structures started to emerge. And in this theoretical vacuum, in Latin America, we see the emergence of a new school of colonial studies. And as the world became more globalized and neoliberalism became a thing, it became the defining feature of the world climate, international actors such as the IMF, Global Bank, donors to developing countries such as Bangladesh began labeling countries as underdeveloped, overpopulated, all of these terms here. The third world label was eventually replaced by the more politically correct term, euphemistic label, developing country. These global actors like IMF, the World Bank, their ideologies were not just politically strategic, but also based on Eurocentric beliefs of, for example, the nuclear family, family of four, hence overpopulated, under-differentiation or reification, homogenization, stereotyping, reductive ways of looking at things led to the logic of defending the exertion of power over poorer states. So 1978, with the publication of Orientalism by Edward Said, we had that new kind of branch in critical studies called post-colonial studies. Some would argue that started with Michel Foucault, or even before that with Nietzsche, who talked about genealogy, and Foucault developed that. And then, of course, in the 80s and 90s, we have Spivak, who is famous for her subaltern theory, and she happens to be a Bengali, and Homi Bhabha, who talks about hybridity and the third space. They were the defining intellectual figures of within the post-colonial critical space. But something was still missing, because when you talk about post-coloniality, it presupposes coloniality or colonialism, in a linear manner, and whatever replaces that becomes post-colonial. It wasn't really exactly what we were referring to in the title of our book. So colonialism and coloniality is simply a reconfiguration of the oppressor and the oppressed. And looking at this image, you see that nothing much has really changed. And then, of course, you have the subaltern. And Spivak says the subaltern are the group of people who are not represented in the rule binary. They are the people, for example, who are the Dalit in India, or people who are transgendered people, or others who have never been showcased in histories. So therein comes the Latin American school of critical studies and the notion of coloniality rather than post-colonialism. And the two names that come up are Walter Mignolo and Aníbal Quijano. They're the ones who popularized, that was towards the end of the 90s, the notion of the coloniality and the decolonial thinking. So on one hand, we have post-colonialism, which comes from Said and Bhabha and Spivak, and it interrogates the British colonial practices in the Indian subcontinent, and of course in the Saharan Africa and the Arab states. That was Said, and it draws, of course, on Derrida and Foucault. It's a critical position against imperialism and Eurocentrism, and it states that the subaltern can't speak, although they can speak among themselves, and that has led to subaltern studies. The case of Thailand, for example, a country that arguably has never been colonized by outsiders. Therefore, you can't use the post-colonial framework to account for the power structures that are characteristic in today's Thailand, because they have never been colonized, so they don't have a post-colonial phase in their life, in a sense. So on the other hand, coloniality and decolonial thinking from the Latin American studies, it is based on a different perception of time, and it looks beyond the linearity of time. So when we refer to the geopolitics of knowledge, we're really looking at the situatedness of the different epistemologies that are part of the simultaneous histories that make up civilization or society at any given time. And this perspective looks at things like capitalism and modernity, forms of knowledge, classificatory systems, social order, even racial and gender hierarchy as the legacy and the outcome of colonialism. And in this tradition, the subaltern can actually speak. And to give you an example, those of you here who are students of literature, you may have read about the magic realism tradition in Latin America. So authors like Jorge Luis Borges, Tristan Corbière, and of course, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Cien Años de Soledad, 100 Years of Solitude. And that shows the simultaneity of magic realism in a society that is otherwise developed. So that is only possible because of that notion of coloniality. So the basic difference between colonialism and post-colonialism, on one hand, and coloniality and decolonial thinking is actually based on the concept of time. And the decolonial thinkers like Keanu and Mignolo argue that we are all trapped in a concept of time that is Eurocentric, that is imposed upon us by Eurocentric ideas, the discourses that were perpetuated during the 19th and 20th centuries all over the world. So on one hand, post-colonial is built on the Western notion of time as singular and universal and linear. So you have colonial period, and then you have post-colonial period, which is not what we are talking about in the book. In the book, we are talking about the power structure that is inherent not just as a legacy of colonial thought or colonial period, but something that has already been there. So until 1971, Bangladesh was part of Pakistan, and until 1947, it was part of British India. So we've always been colonized by others. But what about the linguistic minorities or the religious minorities in today's Bangladesh? They continue to be colonized by whom? Muslim majority Bangladeshis, just like Arif and myself. How has that kind of mindset steeped into the privatization politics in higher education? That is what the book is about, and Arif will be talking about from the next slide. Decolonial thinking, on the other hand, was helpful for us in the book because it allows multiple time concepts of cultures and civilizations upon which the Western Eurocentric civilizations and concepts kind of impose how we should look at the linearity of time and look at post-colonial thinking. And the D indicates the need for an epistemic reconfiguration. And it allows for simultaneous histories. It emphasizes the fact that power is always redistributed, but it's always there. I'll now switch over to Arif, who will now take you into the context of the book. So this part of the discussion was on the theoretical orientation of our understanding of post-coloniality and coloniality. And Arif will talk about how that has manifested in the privatization of higher education in Bangladesh. Over to you, Arif.
Thanks, Raqib Chowdhury, and thank you everybody for attending this seminar. And just I'll go, kind of quick. Just look at. I'm not talking all of the slides, but we'll talk some key aspect of this book. So overall, the organization of this book is. There are some chapters. So the first one is about after the introduction, we'll talk about the neoliberalism, post-colonialism, and global higher education. Then we look at the contemporary trends in Asia, particularly what the higher education, how the higher education in Asia looks like, and then we look at our context, Bangladeshi context. So we look at some key aspects of the neoliberalism. So, for example, a higher education, financial mode of higher education, how politics, power, and controls have been working about there in terms of financing the higher education systems in Bangladesh. And then we also look at higher education governance systems and the quality control mechanism, and for-profit versus non-for-profit debate, and the politics of neoliberal planning in public higher education. Next, please. So just want to give some ideas about how higher education has been working now. So if since 90s, we can see that there is a massive shift in the higher education sector in Bangladesh, particularly based on the neoliberal doctrines. And we can see that two major key policies have been developed in the higher education sector. The first one is Private University Act, and that actually helps to establish private university in Bangladesh. So, and the second major key policy is the Strategic Plan for Higher Education 2006 and 2020. And this policy was developed by the University Grants Commission, so with the support, financial and technical support from the World Bank, and some other policies, additional policies that also have been developed to implement these policies, these two policies. For example, government initiated to amend the Privatisation Act 1992, and finally they developed the Privatisation Act 2010. And based on the strategic plan for higher education, governments develop a 10-year, 9-year, project, higher education quality enhancement project with the financial support from the World Bank. So, and this neoliberal shift, in fact, helps to massive growth in the higher education sector in Bangladesh. For example, next slide, please. For example, you can see that until 1985, Bangladesh has only 5 universities, public universities. All of them are public university. But when the government introduced, enacted the Privatisation Act, we can see that over the last 30 years, 105 private universities have been functioning in Bangladesh. On the other hand, we can see less than half public universities have been working in Bangladesh. So over the period, if you look at the public university, the trend and the nature of the public university sector, that the government intention is to really flourish the public universities in the field of science, technology related universities. So 18 public universities have been developed, were established, and among them, most of them. So government plan is to set up at least one science and technology related university in each districts. So these actually, and even if we look at the students number, there are a lot of students, that's massification. So now at this moment, it's 1.4 million students. They are studying in the higher education sector. And this number has been increased by 10 times by the last, 10 years. So this is huge. So next slide, please. So what we did, just we look at these policies, different policies that have been developed in the higher education sector. And we also talked with different policymakers, academics and journalists and private sector representatives and politicians to look at how the interventional issues have been working when they developed different strategies in the higher education sector based on the neoliberal policy doctrine. So next slide, please. So first, I'd like to talk about the financing mood of higher education in Bangladesh. Next slide. So these are the list, actually, the sources of financing of private universities, and these are not the new in the current context. We know that across the world, these kind of strategies, particularly cost sharing approach, has been using in university sector. But the key thing is here that the political process, how the political process has been working when government developed this kind of cost sharing approach in the Private University Act. So that's the interesting, because when the private university was first introduced in 1992, we can see that government has no role in terms of financing any private university. But now we can see that when they finally in 2010, when they introduced this kind of cost sharing approach, there are some political intention to develop these kind of things. Now, not only these kind of things, how different kind of policy, political powerful house, they can be involved in the higher education. That was the key notion by introducing this kind of financing, source of finance. For example, next slide, please. For example, if we talk about when the negotiation, in fact, in 2008, the army-backed government, they introduced the Privatisation Ordinance 2008. And in that ordinance, government, in fact, identified higher education as not-for-profit organization. But when the political government took the office in 2010, and they introduced, they repealed all the acts, and they introduced new Privatisation Act. And this act, in fact, that the political negotiation between the owner of the private universities and the government, because those who are going to establish the private universities, they are not actually purely the businessmen. We can see that, I'll talk about these issues. We can see that different, policy elites, different political elites, they are getting involved in the setting of the private universities. So that's why what's the mechanism has been working here. The key mechanism here, who control the financing issues of the private university. So and we can see that the owner, they are the key player to look at the private universities financing issues. So that's those who run, like academics, they don't know how much money will be spending for what purpose. They don't know. In fact, they are not supposed to make any questions on these issues. So other stakeholders, they are also bypassed by this situation. So what the government benefit by doing these things? So but we can see that the government actually use this as a way of earning money from the private universities. For example, like last few years, you can see that the government imposed the VAT, value-added tax, on the tuition fees of the students, and that's the way. In fact, government wanted to get benefited from the higher education sectors, private sectors. So let's talk about the public financing issues of the public universities. That's interesting. We see that all of the public universities has been financially supported by the government. But over the last 20 years, you can see that the government contribution to the public universities has been decreased. But on the other hand, we can see that the number of the public universities has been increased by the last 10 years or 10 to 15 years. But the key interesting things here, government always encourages the public universities to adopt the user pays model in the public universities. Again, this issue is not very straightforward, because government knows that it is not easy for them to introduce a different kind of user pays strategies in the public university, because public university was established by the British in 2000. The first university, I'm talking about the first universities. The University of Dhaka was established by the British ruler in 1921 as part of political process. So that was the political compensation to the people of the then East Bengal. So throughout the history, we can see that the public university has a great role, significant role to each and every democratic movement in Bangladesh. And that's why public university now is politically empowered, because governments somehow, all of the governments somehow identified that the public university could be their political force. They can, if they suspend any money, their contribution, stop their contribution to the public university, there is a chance to organize movements against the government. So that's why what government did. So the government policy is very interesting here to control it. So government knows that they can't stop the money. But what they're doing, they are reducing the money. On the other hand, they are using the money, the way they are contributing the financing strategy as a way of controlling the universities, public universities. So that's the interesting things I think. So how they are doing this kind of things? Because they develop different kind of financial accountability for the public universities, so that public universities should be accountable to the government. So this is the way. So government develop the interventional, interventional controlling mechanism to control about the public universities. So let's talk about the governance systems. The governance systems, next slide, please. The governance systems is developed based on the laws, particularly for the private universities. There is a single law. So based on the single law, all of the public universities, private universities have been operating. But for the public universities, there is for each of the public universities, they have their own act. But interestingly, these laws are not kind of similar laws. So different universities enjoys different kind of academic freedom. For example, I can draw example from here. There are 4 public universities, major public universities. They are enjoying more freedom than other public universities. Particularly those universities have been established after a post 2010, particularly after the strategic plan for higher education. So the government plan is to, when they develop the public university, when they develop the strategic plan for higher education, they have the plan to control controlling mechanism in terms of governing system. So after that, we can see that the different kind of governance systems they introduce for the public universities. For example, we can see that the university vice chancellor of these 4 autonomous universities have been selected by the Senate members, and the governments, the chancellor, who is the president of the government of Bangladesh. He is the chancellor for all universities, both public and private universities. But the vice chancellor for these 4 universities, we can see that have been selected by the Senate member, but the government picks someone from these 3 panel members to appoint the vice chancellor of this. But for the other public university, you can see that the government can directly appoint any person from any universities as a vice chancellor or pro vice chancellor. But in terms of private universities, you can see that there is a shift because from the very beginning, that was the control by the totally controlled by the private owners. But the government, when the government initiated the latest act, they wanted to share the power, and that's why governments included, appointed someone from them as a kind of representative in the syndicate member of the private university. So both the University Grants Commission and the Ministry of Education, they are supposed to be member of the syndicate, and syndicate is the highest administrative body of the private university. That's why government wanted to oversee the private universities' governing systems of the governing system. So next slide, please. So I'd like to talk about the quality control. It's a quality control mechanism for both public and private universities. So quality is the very interesting issue in terms of Bangladesh, because quality, this term was used by the private university owner in 1990s. They wanted to they wanted to develop the argument that the public university, the quality of public university has been decreasing over the last years. So that's they influence the government to have alternative higher education systems, and that's why the way they justified the idea of private universities is using the idea of quality. So decreasing the quality issues, quality of the public universities in Bangladesh. So that's the way they justified to establish the public university, private university. But the interesting thing here that we can see that the private universities, over the period, government developed the mechanism to control both the public and private universities. So they developed through the project that has been implemented in both public and private university. They developed the quality assurance, internal quality assurance cell in every university, and this cell is supposed to let the University Grants Commission know about their academic activities. So the thing is here, the public university, they have their own quality assurance mechanism. They have their own academic committee, academic council. That process has been working over there. But now, all of the public universities, they are supposed to inform the Grants Commission about their curriculum, which courses they are going to open, this kind of sort of things we can see here. And so in terms of external involvement, external body involvement, you can say that the government established the Accreditation Council Act, Accreditation Council Council, and the chairman of this council and the other member of this council all are supposed to be appointed by the government. So although the governments are telling us that this is the way, this is the external body, but in reality, this is not the external body. This is the kind of arm's length body. They are looking at the private university, both private and public universities, to look at the quality issues in Bangladesh. So let's talk about the for-profit and not for-profit institutions. So who really controls the private university sectors? We can see that more than 30% owners of the private universities are coming from the businessmen, and a large number of owners are also inclined with the ruling party. And so 9% we can say career politician, and even the businessmen, you can see they are also both businessmen come politician. But what the key factors here, that the government wanted to, as I said, the government wanted to introduce, see the private university, the army-backed governments, as a kind of not-for-profit organization. But now it's government didn't mention anything about whether it is a not-for-profit organization or for-profit organization. You can see that and this dilemma, this vacuum, actually help both the governments and the owner of the public universities to use the private university as a machineries to money-making machine. So next slide, please. So I think this Raqib Chowdhury, you can finish the discussion. Yeah.
Yes, I'm aware of the time, so I'll just quickly finish. Some of the implications for higher education, considering that the audience here would be interested in global higher education, not necessarily in the privatization, not necessarily on Bangladesh, but seeing it as a case study. Some of the questions that we need to consider in researching into higher education would be, who are the true beneficiaries of policy reforms, whether it comes from the government, whether it comes from other vested interest groups, including donors. What discourses are privileged? And when we talk about discourses, it's everything from the notions of underdeveloped or even development, or even reform itself. How do we understand these terms? How are they epistemologically located within the intersection of conflicting ideologies? What is not known? What is the subaltern view in our research in higher education? And finally, because no one is disinterested, because we are all political beings, and if I borrow John Dewey's quote that all education is political, what as researchers are our own espoused agenda? In 2014, I published my first book titled Desiring TESOL and International Education. And in that, I explored how Australian universities, so-called international universities, commodify education in the name of international education, bring in a lot of money. So Arif has just explained about the inherent tensions, the political tensions that is all centered around financial interest in private university in Bangladesh. Thank you.
Raqib, Arif, thank you very, very much. That was a great tour de force, both of post-colonial and decolonial theory, and you gave us a quick sort of and very comprehensive coverage of that, and then you have given us a good and detailed description of how, within a context of expansion and widening participation, what some might call massification, the government has found ways to both share the burden of financial burden or impose the burden on parents and on students, but also found a way of steering a private university sector. So there's lots there for us to think about, and lots of resonances with other contexts and comparative cases we might want to think about as well. None of these things are unique, but the form in which it's taking in Bangladesh is, of course, what we're focusing on today. I'm going to ask Dr. Satish Kumar to come forward first. He's put a first question in the chat. If there are other questions, please do add yours to the chat. Satish.
Yeah, thank you very much, David, and thanks to Raqib and also to Arif. I was really excited in terms of the framework that you were presented there. And as I said, having grown up in the northeast of India, very close to Shillong, which you're familiar with, close to, and being brought up in the books of Ahmad Kamal and Sheikh Masood and all of the historical writings. And then I look at the transformation that's taking place in Bangladesh, the question that comes to, and it's not dissimilar to what's happening in India. Or in Africa for that matter. If you look at Mamdani and Abdul Fattah and all the people, they talk about the same issues about accountability and versus autonomy. How do you maintain autonomy and accountability in the context of higher education? First question, and also in terms of the affirmative action, because there's greater demand in the massification. Sometimes we lose track of that affirmative action side of it in terms of the diversity, that people just don't realize that Bangladesh itself is a very diverse community as well, over and above everything else. So that's that one aspect of it. But I think the more crucial for me is in terms of the nexus. The privatization, what we find is that there is an increasing dilution in terms of the quality, as you rightly mentioned, but in terms of how that dilution is organized systematically over a period of time to reduce the dependence on the public sector or the public university at the cost of. So you don't get a good educational product as a social good. You don't get it from either the public or the private.
Great question to start us off. Raqib and Arif, do you want to respond?
Arif, do you want to respond?
Yeah, go ahead, Raqib.
I think I'll answer the next question from Melanie. You would be better suited to answer this one, Arif.
Okay. Thanks, Satish. Yeah, that's interesting in terms of if you look at the higher education sector in India and Bangladesh, there is huge difference between the way we want to control the university sectors in Bangladesh, and particularly how the nexus has been working here. So the key things here in the Bangladesh, the nexus, it's not about the government and the founders. It's also about between the government and government state apparatus and the different section, different political elite. So they are coming from different backgrounds, but they wanted to have to be part of this nexus. So, for example, if we look at the governments wanted to. In fact, different political government, they wanted to develop new act, because the previous act was it's a very relaxed and very short. But since 2020, we can see that the government wanted to streamline the private university because they wanted to use this university as a business tool. But government failed. Why government failed? Because of the nexus. Because this political elite is very much powerful. Sometimes it's very much powerful than the government. So it seems that I'm not sure how much that has been working, but I'm sure that I talked with the then education minister, and he said that he failed to introduce the new act, so that act could be used to streamline the private university, because he failed because he was forced by his own political fellows to abandon the act. So that's the way. That's the way. Sometimes I often refer that the country we have is still the society is very strong. That's you can see. And but the state is to some extent it's a very weak in terms of controlling different mechanisms. So that's why I'm saying that it's a distinct feature we can see here in the context of Bangladesh. So if you look at the other context, say even Sri Lanka, and as you talked about the Sri Lanka and even India, but in Bangladesh, when the governments change, the different party is coming into power, we can see that the owner of the private interest has been changed sometimes. So this is interesting. Who is going to be the owner, founder of this public university? We can see that most of them are coming from, they are very much related with the ruling party. So that's why we are talking about that's the political nexus. Both political and business nexus has been working here in the private university. Thank you. I hope I explained the things you wanted to know. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Arif. That's really helpful to explicate that. Melanie, do you want to come forward and ask a question?
Hello, hi. Yeah,
Hi.
I just wanted to ask about the linguistic landscape of higher education in Bangladesh, because I know that it's quite interconnected with political systems and ideologies reflected through language. And I was wondering if there's any tension between the use of language of instruction of English, Bengali, but also other dialects such as Sylheti as well. And is there any push from any perspective in terms of the public or students or lecturers even for changing things, or, is it fine the way it is? What's the opinions out there?
Great question, Melanie, and I think it's also an important question. So just to give you a very quick answer, no, there isn't much interest. I say there isn't much because only recently, I think minority languages are being revitalized, not formally by the government, but as part of formal education. But other than that, the tension between English and Bangla, English being the preferred foreign language, compulsory throughout formal education for 12 years, and Bengali, of course, not just the first language, the national language, but if you know the history of the region, which I think you do, I somehow have that feeling because you mentioned Sylheti, which some know isn't really a Bangladeshi language. It's a kind of separate language, etymologically speaking. There is a sentimental value that Bengalis attach to the language Bangla, because of what happened in 1952, the language movement of 1952. Arif and I have actually written a paper called Language Wars, and we are happy to share that with you, Melanie. But to answer your question, the tension between English and Bangla or Bengali in formal education is inherent, it's always there. But in terms of higher education, the tendency is for us to gravitate towards English in not just language classes, in all subjects, for obvious reasons, of course, international education being one, but also having access to the huge treasure trove of literature and resources that's available in English. So that tension is always there. But for minority languages, just recently, we have had some revitalization projects, but it's not being done at a national scale, certainly not in a systematic way. So it's all about Bangla and English, but not really other regional languages. Thank you.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
But that absolutely links to the question of coloniality, doesn't it, in terms of the language, because you focus it in terms of your presentation has been about the financial and governance reforms, but less about the pedagogy and or the language of teaching, which of course would be a whole other fascinating paper. I'm going to ask Mokisor Rahman to come in. You actually raised a lot of points in the chat, so perhaps don't try and ask all of them, but choose one. And if you could ask your question to Rafiq and Arif, please.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to hearing this presentation. It's really, really encouraging. I have actually shared my questions in the chat. So instead of reiterating those questions, if the researchers can respond from there, that would be helpful. So I like to just say only one word. Bangladesh is still, comparing any South Asian countries, even enrollment is much less. and student financing is totally missing. And the two researchers are here. Even academic research and development is very nascent stage. So I think if the researcher can highlight, that will benefit. Over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mokhles. I think some of these are comments rather than questions, but also within the questions, some are beyond the scope of our research. So for example, the first one, access and quality of higher education, or the digitization of higher education, academic research and collaboration. These are not things that we have researched. With regard to the last question, the role of the accreditation council, that's actually a comment. I think we need to understand it better on the formation. Yes, I agree with you. And finally, internationalization of higher education to keep the best graduates. I think it's a question of brain drain, and it's a question of brain migration, or sort of getting returnees back home, those who have studied overseas. It's to do with the economics of higher education, absolutely. That again is beyond the scope of the book, not really what we've discussed here. Arif, would you like to add anything?
No. I think it's our book actually focusing on the political process of these ideas, how these ideas have been developed in the higher education sector. But it's the other way. This is very good observation, because since 1990s, government focus was to look at the expand the access for the people, for the students. And yeah, nowadays it's very low in terms of percentage of the students enrollment, just only less than 4% at this moment. But the interesting thing is here that the access is a kind of, particularly it's a big issue. But now government's the plan. If you look at the secondary education sector or the higher secondary education sector, the government is now planning to develop so that the students can get enrolled in the technical vocational education. So government plan is not to move to accommodate a lot of students in the higher education sector, because the private universities, they are expanding. So it's up to students and parents if they have money. But in terms of public university, government responsibility, they are not talking about these things. They are very rigid to expand these kind of things, very slow. But obviously the idea of quality issues or accreditation council, it's coming as a part of the process. Again, we emphasize the issue of political, because accreditation council, when the government planned to set up the accreditation council act, there is the public university, they, as I said, they are very much empowered, and they wanted to enforce, influence the government not to include the public universities in this mechanism. And they did to some extent, they did, but finally the government included, because the private universities owner, they pressurized the governments. Why the private university only to be supervised the accreditation council? Why not the public university? So that's the conflicting situation between these public and private universities. And we can see that now government introduced in the set up the accreditation council. But again, the quality is the issue now, because government wanted to take this opportunity to bring the higher education to the world level. So now government encourages all universities to improve the quality, but they don't have any specific mechanism, but they are pressurizing the both public and private universities. So you need to introduce, for example, different kind of promotion, academic promotion, this kind of sort of things you can see governments encourages the academics of the public universities. And I can give an example from the University of Dhaka, but last 2 years, you can see that the Dhaka University introduced a large number of policy initiatives so that the academics can publish their papers in the referred journal. Not only that, they also develop different kind of strategies to attract international students and this kind of sort of things. So they wanted to show at least one university could be in the world ranking, at least 400 or 200, rank. So that's the way the government wanted to show, because we can see the economical developments. It's Bangladesh is the fastest economical growth countries in the South Asia. So they wanted to show that the higher education sector should be like that. So that's the way government, in fact, treated the idea of quality so far. Thank you.
Okay, that's very comprehensive, and I mean the questions that that are being raised here around the expansion or the slow rate of expansion, I think are important context here, because I think that's sort of helping us understand why the government's doing some of the things it's doing, which is trying to, I guess, widen access. But I mean, I'd love to ask you more about that, but I'm actually going to ask the next three speakers, questioners, to sort of to provide all their questions together, so that we have a chance to hear from all of them. So first, Feroz Alam, if you'd like to come forward, and then followed by Halal and Monica Jaiswal. So Feroz, do you want to come up and ask a question?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Chowdhury and Professor Kabir, for a wonderful presentation. I have one question which is epistemic, the other question is ontological. When Professor Chowdhury was talking about the theoretical foundation of their book, I couldn't help but thinking about scholars like Anzul Dua, scholars like Ngugi, when they're talking about decolonizing mind. I was wondering, as a post-colonial subject, in order to theorize the landscape of higher education, how are we to escape epistemic racism? Like if we think, obviously 3 of us, we grew up in Bangladesh. We grew up studying information like Columbus discovered America and all the other kinds of information. So can the subaltern or individuals like us can theorize our subjective position, our own subjectivity in an epistemic location that is fundamentally colonial, that is fundamentally imperial, and it hasn't gone. I loved that slide that shows, what was, colonialism and post-colonialism. Only the shackle holder has changed. Again, we are familiar with Machiavellianism, brown skin, British mind, right? So that's a question that is epistemic. And the other question that I loved, Professor Kabir, when he mentioned that public university has been the center for political resistance, dissidents in Bangladesh. And obviously Dhaka University is the ultimate example. But what we are seeing gradually, that the depoliticization of public universities, at the same time, politicization at the same time. Neoliberal assault on education is not only happening in Bangladesh, globally. When Melanie asked that question wonderfully, that what language, is being taught, dare I say that we are experiencing an academic apartheid. I mean, I've been an educator for over 2 decades, that in Bangladesh, we have schools where students pay tuition fees over 4 million local currency, American International School of Dhaka. Where the international curriculum, by the way, I have been an educator in those schools, so I know that the students are taught fundamentally colonial, imperial discourses. And these are the students, and this is where I find fundamentally problematic. These students go from Dhaka to Columbia to Australian National University, right? So global elites don't have a location. You can be in Dhaka or in Manhattan, it's all the same. So the entire academic structure in Bangladesh is like divided. How are we to think about, to the question, to the point of Professor Kabir, that we can think about the academic apartheid, that is structurally the subaltern's voice is suffocated, like you can't talk. So these are 2 questions to both of you.
Let me go first. Firoz, first
sorry,
of all,
I'm going to stop you there. Sorry, Raqib. Because we haven't got much time, I'm going to ask, just hang on to those thoughts, and let's just hear from Halal and Monica, and then perhaps you can bring it all together at the end. Halal?
Thank you. I'm sorry. Actually, I can't open my video. Thank you, Dr. Chowdhury and Dr. Kabir. Actually, I know Arif Bhai from my very student life. So I had a question like, like we see that coloniality is manifested to the privatization, the privatization of not only higher education in Bangladesh, like the privatization of the whole education system. So I was curious about like how the coloniality, that is evident in the privatization or like higher education in private universities is different than the coloniality that is evident in higher education in public universities, except for the privatization. Like if you had, I know that that was not the scope of your research or book, but I was curious because I am actually focusing on like how coloniality is evident in public universities and public education in Bangladesh. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Halal. And then one last question from Monica, and then Raqib and Arif can respond.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Chowdhury. So glad to hear. I've been reading a lot of your work, so I'm really excited to see your presentation and also Dr. Kabir. My question is very simple, but complicated in terms of economic landscape. Bangladesh has the rising economies in terms of global growth. A lot of products are coming out of Bangladesh. So how do these institutions now are playing direct role in creating jobs there? And how do the students coming out of these institutions find themselves being placed, in terms of these in the job markets? And is there a direct link in terms of placing them in the jobs created by several sectors that are finding themselves growing and contributing to the economic landscape? Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. So there's the three questions ranging from the big question of coloniality to the practicalities of how private universities might link into particular sectors, which I think is a great question as well, on a very sort of more functional level. So you have a couple of minutes to wrap up. Raqib and Arif, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you. Let me start with Monica's because it's 2 a.m. here and my brain is almost dead, but I'll just, it's a short, snappy question and I have a short, snappy answer, hopefully. So Monica, great question. And it's really about employability. So I think the vocationalization of higher education is actually better done by the public sector education in Bangladesh, in higher education, rather than private sector. And the network has grown substantially over the last couple of decades, but Arif can probably elaborate a bit more on. The first question was from Firoz, and what a beautiful question. I mean, both questions. And, I love the way you've actually talked about academic apartheid and epistemic racism. And you know what? You've actually answered the questions you've actually answered the questions by posing them, because what you're talking about is the clear divide between those who have the opportunities and the privileges and those who don't have. And it's true, in schools we are still being taught that America was discovered by Columbus and things like that. Not just that, but if you think about the essay writing that is taught both in Bangla and English in schools, I'm talking about schools, of course, high schools included, not university. It's a very kind of idealized way in which we talk about patriotism, for example, or Bangladesh being the most beautiful country or land of 6 seasons and all of that. How do you expect then for these people to be critical thinkers at the higher education stage, or even those who are privileged to have studied at international schools, going to Columbia, coming to Australian National University and all of that? It's a very clear divide, absolutely clear divide. And it is systemic, it is structured in that way. And unfortunately, the data sets that Arif and I used for this book came from politicians, businessmen, came from academics. None of these people, the privileged people that you mentioned, Firoz, were actually in the data set. We actually didn't hear about them. But I would think there is a degree of cynicism, skepticism, maybe even indifference as with regard to their commitment in doing something meaningful for higher education in Bangladesh. So, it's really a question of not only whether they are able to do anything, but do they actually care? And I'm not sure if that's a Bangladeshi thing, or if it is a thing that globally characterizes the elite group from the rest. But wonderful question. Thank you, Firoz. Arif?
Thanks, Firoz and Helal. Just I'd like to talk about a little bit, not too much, because time does not allow us. So
two minutes.
First thing is, whether we know that the depoliticization of the universities, both public and private universities. So it's interesting in terms of, we can see that the public university is in the process of depoliticization, but how the difference between public and private universities. So in terms of political awareness, so you can see that, as I said, that it's a political process. Public university, this evolved in a political process, and this rich political process, and in fact helps the students. Although there are a lot of elements over there to depoliticize the environment, but we can see that these rich, political elements, help the student to be aware about the political process of Bangladesh. And it's a very evidence in Dhaka University. If you look at the 2018, the movement against the army-backed government in 2008, so that's not far. So depoliticization process has been started far away. But now the problem is here, whether this depolitical process, whether the awareness of the students or the academics, these are the fundamental issues of democratic practice in Bangladesh. That's the questions, whether these students are aware of these issues. I think it's a very I can say that it's a very burning issue in the context of Bangladesh. I don't think so that the students they are talking about the democratic practice. Rather, they are talking. They know about what is happening in the country context, but there are other factors have been working over there. So that's why, but the thing is, if this kind of great things could happen, we don't know. Like if there is any way to organize any kind of democratic movements. Still, I think all section of people, and even we can give an example. Shabaka movements. That was happened in 2016. So a lot of concerned students, they organize these kind of things. So that's why depoliticization process is there. But students and the academic, they are very much aware about through the way the public university has been developed here. That's their strength. That's the way they are getting empowered. So that's And so in terms of the questions, Helal, just there is a difference between the private university and public university. I think. I can draw the example in terms of the subject. So which of the subjects have been offering by the private university? If you look at the subject and the content, you can see that the private university totally concentrated on some business-oriented issues, where the public universities, they are still struggling to open. Now it's very difficult for every public university to open general knowledge-based subject. It's very difficult, but you can see this kind of subject here. So the knowledge, the way we are getting knowledge, the generator knowledge, there is a difference between public and private universities. There is a difference in terms of using the language, as Monica said, that public universities still they want to use Bengali, and the students, there still this kind of emotion we can see in the academics, and the students they want to use. But the private universities, they are advertising that their course has been offering in English. So yeah, there is lots of different in terms of the way they are generating the knowledge and the way they are running their universities. Thank you for your questions.
Great. We're over time, so we're going to have to wrap up. Thank you both for a really fascinating deep dive into the sort of complexities of privatization and what these different universities are doing and how students are or understanding or reacting to them. You've given us yet another great CGHE webinar. The transcript and the video will be up tomorrow on our YouTube channel. Thank you all for coming. And Raqib, you can now get some sleep. It's definitely well past your bedtime. Thank you all. Well done.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, David. Thank you,
Bye.
Trevor. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Arif. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.